Okay, guys, there was definitely online panic. Tons of panic. Understandably so. Like I said, Blake was out there doing the absolute most, claiming victory. Oh, I've been vindicated. I'm a wonderful person. Just forget about everything that you guys read. Her PR agents were so desperate to make the public believe that they really had delivered a victory. And the headlines were very confusing because it said the lawsuit was dropped. Good job on her PR firm. Obviously, that is not true. But it is true that the defamation portion of the lawsuit was dropped entirely. So the first thing you need to understand is we got to get back to the beginning of this situation. It's a lot. It's a lot to remember, which means that there's a lot that you can forget. When Justin Baldoni and co. initially filed a lawsuit against Blake Lively, there were actually two lawsuits that were happening. Remember, the New York Times, they had sued for $200 million. He was suing the New York Times for libel, false light, invasion of privacy, promissory fraud, and breach of implied in fact contract. That's very important to remember that, okay? Separately, he sued Blake Lively, Ryan Reynolds, and
on Candace Owens' show, explosive revelations hit about Justin Baldoni's lawsuit against Blake Lively in the New York Times. A judge drops critical claims because the Times is essentially untouchable due to CIA connections and a legal actual malice standard. Plus, Taylor Swift's secret messages could blow this wide open. Let's break this down.
Leslie Sloan PR and her PR firm Vision PR for $400 million, and they brought against them 7 causes of action. So negligent interference with prospective economic advantage, intentional interference with prospective economic advantage, intentional interference with contractual relationships, breach of implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing, and then false light and invasion of privacy, defamation, and civil extortion. So the repeated claims in those two suits, across both of those lawsuits, New York Times and Blake Lively and co., were defamation, false light, and invasion of privacy. And so that is why, right off the bat, it should be perfectly understandable. If you have been a committed listener to the Candace show, if you have been following this lawsuit through me, then you should understand that ruling and why they dropped those parts of the lawsuit and then dropped the lawsuit in its entirety against the New York Times. Because, I'll tell you why, it's perfectly understandable, because of history, because of American history. Do you guys remember that episode where I made it very clear to you guys that the New York Times is an extension? It is a publishing arm of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, right? They have been an arm of the CIA probably since its inception, to be honest, but we know at least since Operation Mockingbird. We did an episode where I discussed this with you. I said, this is really important, especially you guys that are in my book club. You know, this is not a conspiracy theory, okay? If you've read Chaos, you know my obsession with the 1960s in America. The CIA was just going crazy, getting away with all sorts of things, murdering people, sex blackmail, sexual blackmail.
This exposed the deep state roots entangled with mainstream media, showing how powerful agencies manipulate narratives and protect their allies at any cost.
Blackmail, you name it. But the big thing was the shooting of JFK, right? In broad daylight, next to his wife, being driven in a car, JFK was shot. And the CIA then did the absolute most to shut down conversation, conspiracy, as they called it. In fact, that is when they started coining that term conspiracy theorist, was to get people to stop asking questions about this shooting, probably because they were covering their own crime, okay? And one of the things that they did to try to settle down the public, to try to control public perception, was that they put journalists and entire publications on their payroll. That is what Operation Mockingbird was. It was the CIA reaction to all of the obvious questions and the quote unquote conspiracies that were shaping regarding what the heck happened on that day in Dallas when a sitting president was shot by our dear friend and ally, maybe. I don't know. Just saying. Okay, so I'm just taking you back through the episode. I showed you guys this Wikipedia excerpt, and it says plainly here that in 1975, they were looking backwards at Operation Mockingbird. The Church Committee Congressional Investigations revealed agency connections with journalists and civic groups. And elsewhere, it tells us that one of the people that contributed was Arthur Sulzenberg, who heads up the New York Times, right? Arthur, his family has owned the New York Times. It was initially founded by Adolph Ochs, who was his father-in-law, and Arthur Hayes Sulzberger basically was working for the CIA. And that became abundantly clear in an article that Rolling Stone did, unveiling everybody who was working with the CIA Times and essentially, like I said, telling us what to think. And I want to say this to you guys, why that's so relevant, and you should really remember this going forward. It is quite literally, and forget how you feel about Trump, it is quite literally fake news. Maybe it's not even fake news, it's state news, which implies that it's fake. It's the government trying to make sure they can control the population, to make sure that you guys are not doing anything out of its control. And the best way to do that is to make people think that it is a token of their education to read the New York Times. When you think about the New York Times, you do think about that, right? You're like, oh yes, I read this person reads the New York Times daily. They'll even put this in movies and in shows, like the whole idea of somebody opening a newspaper, the thud of the newspaper, somebody reading the newspaper. It is represented as a symbol of someone's education. I remember, because I majored in journalism in college, that we were taught to go to sources that could be trusted. And we were quite literally learning that as good journalists, we could trust and rely upon the New York Times when conducting any research, and that we should aspire to work for the New York Times. But the reality is, it's a fact that they are an arm of the state, and they are very powerful. And they became more powerful around this exact same time when JFK was shot, because the CIA had to make sure that they were untouchable, so that they could go out and they could lie about people, but also making sure that they wouldn't be sued for defamation. So you guys know what happened? Okay. They created in 1964 the actual Malice standard for politicians and celebrities.
This legal shield built by and for the New York Times makes holding media accountable almost impossible, an elite protection racket in plain sight.
That effectively means, just so you understand, that journalists can lie about celebrities, as they very much did in the matter of Justin Baldoni, and it is nearly impossible for those celebrities and politicians to win against them, even if they can prove this is a lie. Everything you said about me is not true. They'll come back and they'll say, well, yes, the journalist lied, but I don't think they had any malice when they lied. There was no actual malice here. They didn't act in reckless disregard for the truth, which is a nonsense height that you have to scale. It makes entirely no sense. Essentially, they're asking, yeah, we know that they lied, but did they really, really, really know that it was false and try to hurt you? If not, oh well. Now, that standard was quite literally created by the New York Times. The standard was that case that was the landmark case was New York Times versus Sullivan. Again, dating back to that time around JFK getting shot. They needed the New York Times to be untouchable. So what happened in 1964 regarding this case was, the story essentially is the New York Times ran this article, okay? And it was actually an advertisement that it ran. And it was pertaining to civil rights protests that were happening at the time, right? 1964, you think about the civil rights unrest that was going on in this country. Those of you that are in my book club, you know a lot of those civil rights protests were inorganic. It was actually our government, which they do is that they try to foment racial unrest for specific reasons. We don't need to get into all of that right now, but just know that this case, the New York Times, what essentially happened was they ran an advertisement. And in this advertisement, I want you to really understand how absurd it was. The full-page advertisement claimed that in Montgomery, Alabama, there were these student civil rights protesters, okay? And that they had a clash with the police, and that the Alabama police locked these students on a college campus in a dining hall with a padlock, and that the police tried to starve them into submission. That truckloads of Alabama police had descended, and these brave civil rights protesters, these students, were resisting in a cafeteria, and the police said, then you just starve, and you'll die until you do what we want. And they did it with a padlock. Woo, that creates quite imagery. So if you're this elite reading the newspaper, you're going, oh my dear, we must get behind these civil rights protests. These poor students are being starved to death in the racist South. The only thing is that it never happened. That was made up. It was just completely made up. And so the Montgomery Commissioner of Public Affairs was this guy named L.B. Sullivan. He's like, excuse me, New York Times, this is crazy. You can't just be out here saying that we're locking students with padlocks. I'm going to sue you for libel. And I'm going to cite the obvious fact that this lie that we would starve students to get what we wanted because you're trying to foment racial unrest in America has severely impacted my reputation because I am the man, LB Sullivan, that is responsible for the police department. Like, what are you doing? And guess what? He sued them on the local level and he won his case. And he didn't have to prove anything other than the fact that they had lied. And the New York Times said, that isn't good. So they appealed. And then he beat them again on the state level. They said, yeah, no, he won about $500,000 in damages. And they're like, no, it's crazy. You can't just lie and make something up. So the New York Times said, okay, state rights, but what about at the tippity top? Let's take this to the Supreme Court. New York Times versus Sullivan. And guess what? The government sided with the government, meaning the New York Times at the time was working with the CIA, and they created a new standard, actual malice, a unanimous decision that, you know what, it is First Amendment, so it is also necessary for publications to be allowed to lie in the interest of the public, because we don't want to get in the way of free speech, and they need to hold these public officials' feet to the fire, and they'll be afraid to do so if they can't lie. That's crazy, but that is what the actual malice standard is. Like, you have to be able to somehow prove they acted in full reckless disregard for the truth, which I would say, not fact checking whether or not students were locked in a cafeteria with a padlock would be acting in reckless disregard of the truth. But what am I? What do I know? Exactly nothing against the federal government. So the moral of the story here is that the actual malice standard was literally developed to protect the New York Times. They have been corrupt forever. The New York Times is effectively the publishing arm of the CIA, which means that Justin Baldoni just tried to sue the CIA, okay? Big mistake. Nobody wins against the New York Times, okay? They have told egregious lies for years against celebrities, against politicians that have, of course, led to real world consequences, but they always get away with it. Like, we were just looking, me and the producers, like, who wins against them? Sarah Palin just lost against them. Skylar, you were just talking about the story where even an Ohio Supreme Court justice sued them for an egregious lie, and he actually won. So you have think about this, a Supreme Court judge has even sued the New York Times for their lies. And even though he won, he wasn't awarded anything for damages. So I don't know what kind of a win that is. They were just like, okay, fine, we're lying, we're getting caught lying again. But they get away with it because the goal is to shape public opinion. And by then the damage is done. And the CIA knows that they can always protect them in court. Now, this becomes especially relevant when you remember the old story that we covered, okay? The headline that Blake Lively had engaged the CIA alum, okay, the crisis PR firm, in her battle against Justin Baldoni. And we went, I said, that's very interesting that she did that. That Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds are moving to hire a PR crisis manager. His name was Nick Shapiro. He was formerly of the CIA. He worked for the CIA's he was the CIA's deputy chief of staff, and he worked beneath their director, John Brennan, who's implausibly corrupt. Why did they engage this firm? Because, guys, I hate to tell you this, America's ghetto and corrupt. Like, that's reality. It's ghetto and corrupt. Like, that is the reality. And the New York Times is going to be the New York Times, and they know that they're going to be protected. And so the best way to think about this case is that the Justin Baldoni hit piece originated from the CIA-protected New York Times.
The heart of the scandal, that Baldoni tried to take on a media machine intertwined with government power, and predictably, the system shut him down.
So on June 10th, I wasn't shocked when Judge Lehman did what always happens in these matters pertaining to the New York Times/CIA lawsuits. He entirely dismissed the lawsuit against the New York Times, and then he necessarily had to dismiss any of the repeated claims that were in Blake Lively's filings. Because you can't say, okay, the New York Times is not guilty, but Blake and Ryan are. You have to gut it from their lawsuit as well. And that's exactly what he did. On June 10th, he ruled that Justin Baldoni cannot sue Blake Lively after dismissing the New York Times one, that he cannot sue Blake Lively for defamation over the claims that she made in her legal filing because the allegations made are exempt from libel. He also ruled that that Baldoni could not sue her for extortion under California law. Now, the extortion piece would have also dragged the New York Times into it, because don't forget, regarding the extortion, they would have forced the New York Times to go into discovery, because the claim was that Blake Lively wanted the rights to the movie and she was extorting them, saying that you give me what I want or I will go public with claims of sexual harassment, allegedly. And so in order for them to prove that, they would have subpoenaed messages with her. And who was she going to go public with? The New York Times. So everything the judge just did, in my view, was to protect the CIA. That is why everyone was so surprised. I was like, no, this is how it works. If you pay attention, it is, you cannot sue the CIA. You cannot win against the government. And there are so many public cases that have happened. I mean, Jeffrey Epstein, he was walking free, okay? And we learned from Acosta, from Secretary Acosta, once Trump had appointed him, he said, I was told to let Jeffrey Epstein walk free. Even when this man was caught with crimes against minors, he was being told that he was an asset and he was to let him free, and he listened. So do not ever operate under the delusion that there is not a hand that works above judges. It simply does. And that hand is the federal government, the deep state. Now, after gutting those portions of a lawsuit, which are to be expected, the judge then said, okay, now what's left here are your claims which have nothing to do with the New York Times.
The judge's dismissal of defamation claims highlights how the New York Times CIA ties and the actual Malice legal standard insulate powerful media entities from accountability. Baldoni's struggle shows what happens when individuals confront this corrupt establishment. Yet, the tortious interference claims remain alive, keeping the battle open against Blake Lively. Taylor Swift's text may finally bring new evidence into the light. Drop your take below on this Hollywood CIA media cover-up and the war over truth.